So in this video I wanted to discuss and explain secondary chords, essentially what they are and why they're used. Now secondary chords are used in a process called tonicization, which is a terrible word, but essentially all it means is making a chord other than the tonic chord in the key that you're in sounds temporarily like the tonic chord. Now that sounds a bit confusing, but when I go over an example, it'll start to make sense to you. And essentially, it's kind of like changing key for a really short period of time. So whereas if in a song you're playing a song in, say, C major, if it changes key to D major and the rest of the song sort of continues in that key, that's called modulation. But if you only change key for like a fraction of a bar or a really short period of time, then we don't call that modulation, we call that tonicization. There's a bit of a technicality, but essentially that's what we're going to do here. Now tonicization can be done either through a secondary dominant chord or a secondary leading tone chord, and I'll explain both in this lesson. Now the reason we use secondary chords, or the reason we tonicize chords, is to make the chord progression a little bit more interesting and a little bit more harmonically complex, and to create a stronger pull towards the resolving chord. Now the best way to make sense of all that technical music jargon that I just sort of threw around is to go over an example, which we'll do now, and I'll sort of explain it as we go. So let's start with a really classic chord progression that'll go 1, 6, 2, 5, and we'll do it in the key of C major. So the chord progression would go C major 7 to A minor 7 to D minor 7 to G7 to C major 7. So it sounds. So now that's a really standard 1, 6, 2, 5. The reason it sounds nice is because it follows a cycle of fifths chord progression, that is this A minor down to the D minor, down to the G7, and G7 down finishing on the C. Now let's take that really simple chord progression and tonicize the D minor. Now what that means is we're going to change the chord progression slightly so that the D minor 7 temporarily sounds like the tonic chord or the 1 chord before again the 1 chord reverting back to the actual 1 chord, the C major 7. Now the way you do that is by inserting a secondary dominant chord. That is a dominant chord from the point of view of the D minor 7, from the point of view of the tonicized chord. So from the D minor 7, the 5 chord from the point of view of D minor is A7. So we're going to put in the A7 in front of the D minor 7. And we're going to do that in place of the A minor 7. So now our chord progression is going to look like this. C major 7 to A7 to D minor 7 to G7 to C major 7 again. So now it's going to sound like this. So if you listen carefully, it sounds like we're in C major, then we play the A7, which has the C sharp. Now the C sharp isn't in the key of C major, so it sounds like we've changed key. And because it's a dominant, the dominant naturally wants to resolve to the 1 chord, which is the D minor. So for those 2 chords, the A7 to the D minor 7, it sounds like just for a split second, for a bar, we've changed key to the D minor. Then when we hit the G7, it sounds like we've gone back into the actual, the primary tonic, I suppose we can call it, of the C major 7. So essentially that's all tonicization really means. It means picking a different chord in the chord progression, in this case the D minor 7, and turning that into a temporary secondary tonic chord by inserting the dominant fifth from the point of view of that chord. Now I said earlier that we do this to add a bit more interest and complexity to the song, and that C sharp does exactly that. The C sharp is not in the key of C major, So it sounds a bit more unexpected and a bit more sort of unusual because you've suddenly got a C sharp in place of the C. And secondly, I said that using a secondary dominant helps more strongly resolve to the next chord, the D minor. And the reason is that with the A minor 7, so when we have the C, that C resolves to the D when you change chords. And that's a interval of a tone. Whereas with a secondary dominant, we have the C sharp, and that C sharp now resolves to the D. And that's an interval of a semitone. And so because the interval is a bit closer, the leading note is a semitone rather than a whole tone away from the root note that we're resolving to. So musically that's a stronger resolution because there's a movement of a semitone to get to the root of the next chord rather than a movement of a tone. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos, you would have seen one on chord substitutions and passing chords. And this is where music theory gets a little bit sort of ambiguous and it starts overlapping, because there's a number of different ways to think about this A7 chord. In the context of this video, I'm explaining the A7 chord as a secondary dominant going to the tonicized D minor, or D minor 7, before again changing back to the C major. But you can also think of that A7 as a passing chord to get us to the D minor 7. And then yet another way to think about that A7 is as a substitute chord for the A minor 7. A really common substitute chord in jazz is just changing from the minor to the dominant. And so by changing from the A minor 7 to the A7, that's exactly what we're doing. So depending on how you think about it, that A7 could be either a secondary dominant, a passing chord, or just a chord substitution, or really all three things at once. And that's why if you've watched some of my other videos, I refer to this kind of chord progression, a 1, 6, 2, 5, where the 6 is a dominant, as a cycle of fifths chord progression. Even though it probably technically isn't, because the A7 isn't in the key of C major, the A minor 7 is. So a true cycle of fifths chord progression would go 1, 6 with the A minor 7, 2, 5. But because you could effectively just substitute in the A7 in place of the A minor 7, I just call it a circle of fifths chord progression anyway. So that's using a secondary dominant to resolve to the tonicized chord. There is another way you can tonicize a chord, and that's by using the leading tone chord, or the chord one semitone down from the tonicized chord. So if we use that same chord progression, the 1, 6, 2, 5, and we decide to toninize the D minor 7 again, but this time we can tonicize it by using the leading note chord, or the 7th chord, from the point of view of the D minor 7, or the tonicized chord, which would be C sharp full diminished. Now this works in the same way as the secondary dominant chord, because we've got that C sharp up here, which is the leading note that resolves to the D. But in this case we've got the leading note in the root of the diminished. So now the chord progression will sound something like this. So again, we start on the C major 7 in the key of C, we go up to the C sharp full diminished, which makes it sound like we've changed key to the tonicized chord, to the D minor. Then we hit the D minor, which is the tonicized chord, to the G7, which brings us back to the key of C major, back to C. Now another way to think about that secondary leading note chord is if we play it and play the A down the bottom, then it looks like a dominant chord with a flat 9. And again, that's another reason it works. It's effectively an extended dominant chord, resolving to the tonicized D minor. So again, using both of those secondary chords, the dominant or the leading tone chord, you can temporarily make it sound like the D minor is the new tonic key. So it sounds like there's been a change in key just for a moment before again reverting back to the original tonic key, or the true tonic key, or the primary tonic key, whatever you want to call it, the C major. Now this idea can be extended to any note in the key that you're in, so in the key of C major. It can be extended to any note in the C major scale, except for the tonic, obviously, because if you play the 5 chord of the tonic, you get back to the actual tonic. You can't tonicize a chord that's already the tonic. And the 7 chord, so the B diminished, or half diminished. And the reason is that a tonic chord has to be a major or a minor. You can't resolve to a diminished chord, or to a half diminished chord. So any other note in the C major scale, D, E, F, G, A, can be tonicized by putting in a 5 chord from the point of view of the tonicized chord. So if we have a chord progression that goes C major 7 to E minor 7, then we can tonicize that chord progression by playing C major 7 to the 5 chord from the point of view of the E, which would be B7, then going to the E minor. So it'll sound like this. You can tonicize the F major by making the C major 7 become a C dominant 7, going to the F major. And you can tonicize the G major by putting in a D7 beforehand, so you can tonicize the A by putting in a E7 beforehand. Right, so you can tonicize any of those notes. And you can use that idea to create a little bit of a cycle of fifths progression by doing something like C major 7 to B7, to E minor 7 to A7, to D minor 7 to G7 to C major 7. So breaking that down, that went C major to B7, which made E minor the tonicized chord. We went to E minor, then we went to A7, which made D minor the tonicized chord. We went to D minor, then we went to the G7, which brought us back to the C as the tonic chord. So that's a little bit of a cycle of fifths like chord progression, but using secondary dominants. And you can take that a little bit further by not actually resolving to the tonicized chord. So you can play C major 7 to B7 to E7 to A7 to D7 to G7 to back to C major 7. So all of those chords were dominant chords. And that type of chord progression is used in songs like I Got Rhythm and Sweet Georgia Brown. And so that's effectively a non-resolving secondary dominant chord progression. So we play the B7, which means we've tonicized the E minor, but we don't resolve to the E minor. Instead we go to the E7, which puts us in the key of A minor. But we don't resolve to the A minor. Instead we go to the A7, and so on. So you do see quite a bit of that in jazz. And you can take that one more step further, and instead of having a secondary 5, you can have a secondary 2-5. So if we take that same chord progression, C major 7 to A minor 7, D minor 7, G7, C major 7, and we tonicize the D minor again, instead of just putting in the secondary 5, you can put in a secondary 2-5, which would be E minor 7 flat 5 to A7 to D minor. So you'd go something like, so there I went C major 7 to E half diminished, or E minor 7 flat 5, A7 to D minor. So that was a 2-5 from the point of view of the D minor, or the tonicized chord, going to the tonicized chord, to G7, which takes us back into C. And now Now finally, I've been tonicizing chords that are in the key that we're in. So in the key of C major, the D minor is the 2 chord. So that chord is in the key of C major. But you can also tonicize non-diatonic chords if you like. Like for example in the Bird Blues chord progression, which is effectively like a 12-bar blues played in the style and with the chord substitutions used by Charlie Parker, who was known as the Bird. You have something like this: E minor 7 going to A7, E flat minor 7 going to A flat 7, D minor 7 going to G7, and finally finishing on the 1. So that's effectively using secondary 2/5s, but moving down chromatically rather than diatonically. So the E minor 7 going to the A7 is in the key of D major. So that's the D being tonicized, but the D major in this case. The E flat minor 7 going to the A flat 7 is in the key of D flat major. So then that's the chord being tonicized, the D flat major. And then finally the D minor 7 to the G7 is in the C major 7, which is the tonic key. So there we've done I suppose a tertiary or a secondary 2/5, and then another 2/5 in a non-diatonic key, and then the 2/5 in the tonic. So that's more or less all you need to know about secondary chords and tonicizing chords. It's not really as complex as it sounds. So play around with a few of those ideas and feel free to leave any comments or ask any questions if you'd like me to clarify something.